So we were we were starving people at the time. Uh, in We were sanctioning Iraq at the time that Marshy said that. And I found that when I think about it, it's odd that he talked about bombing. Now, how many people did that bombing kill? Did it kill 200 or 2,000 or 20,000? And the news media hasn't told us, so we don't really know that it killed 20,000. I mean, we killed 1.3 million in Iraq since 9/11, but before that, we killed 500,000 of children by having all those sanctions against Iraq during the 90s. And Madeleine Albright said, she said, "Oh yeah, I think it was a good idea, you know, it was a good thing. They had to do it, that kind of crap." But she said that right on the news, right on the interview there. Some CNBC lady had the integrity to ask her that question. So we know what kind of monsters that are in charge of our government. And so, um, there's consequences to this, to all these going into the Middle East. There's consequences to all the inflation that we have to be able to pay for war, and we've lost. We have the Patriot Act and NSA spying and all that. We've got real consequences here, and the inflation since 1913, and actually before that there was some inflation too. That's why they had bubbles in the 19th century. It's always caused by government inflation. Central bank inflation, government inflation doesn't make any difference if it's a private bank. I mean, that's just conspiracy, ignorance of economics. And they're both, if they're in bed together, or if just the government does it. In some countries, just the government does it. So what? There's every country has different ways of limiting its tyranny. So our central bank has had limited tyranny, but it still had tyranny for the last 100 years. So anyway, uh, uh, if you create bubbles through inflation, it distorts the way investments are made according to savings. And in other words, savings and investments are not coordinated anymore. They're discoordinated because the inflation of the government, where they increase the money supply, gives false interest rates. So the investors and the savers have contrary impulses, because as the interest rate goes down, because they inflate it, because if you create more of something, it's worth less, therefore the interest rate drops. The savers are less and the investors are more, and so there's no coordination. So through time, they don't meet. Over a 5-year investment cycle, there's nobody that has the resources to purchase what they invested in. They have these false investments, malinvestment, as Ron Paul called. Throughout the history of inflation in the United States, and the people of the early scholastics of Spain in 16th, 17th century predicted all this, understood this whole phenomenon, as did the Austrians 200 years later. Throughout the history of the United States, people have known that inflation was bad, that it would create bubbles. And but here's the difference, you see. Why? Because when I tell my sit-off friends this, and they say, "Well, people are saying this for 20 years." Well, first of all, we had a collapse in 2000. The stock market collapsed. We had a collapse in 2008. The housing bubble broke, and the banks went broke. But this is different. This is worse. What the situation now is worse, because not only is there very little productivity, that the production is all going overseas because of the government's driving away business. It has nothing to do with low wages overseas. That's just propaganda. That's sort of zero-sum propaganda, because what's that principle of economics, that you always let the more efficient, you always let people do what they're best at. I forget what the name of the principle is. It doesn't matter if you happen to be more efficient at it, but you can't decide, the government can't decide who's efficient, who ought to do something. And so, um, and you know, you can't engineer society. That's ridiculous. That's the whole problem. And but the situation now is different from all the other bubbles in the past. The situation in the U.S. is different since 1971, when we violated the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was predicted by Henry Hazlitt, who wrote Economics in One Lesson. When Nixon took us off the gold standard, he defaulted on the debt, on the obligation to pay in gold, because the government wanted to inflate, and so they inflated during the 70s, and then they didn't inflate as much in the 80s because of Paul Volcker, who was appointed by Carter and kept on by Reagan. So, but the difference is, between this inflation and all the inflations in the past, is the whole world's inflating simultaneously, and they're propping the dollar up. They're inflating in order to prop the dollar up because of Keynesian economics, because special interests in those countries, and because I don't know what the third reason would be, but the world, but when the dollar loses demand, when there's a loss of demand for the dollar because the inflation gets so much, the interest rate goes up, then it's a spiral, because the Federal Reserve has two choices. They have two choices. They can either buy up everything by printing money, by creating money out of thin air, or they can let the government collapse and the housing bubble collapse. And of course, that's politically unacceptable. And so, how are you going to, how are you going to expect that the Federal Reserve will do the right thing and let the thing collapse, which is the withdrawal from the addiction of cheap money, of inflation, and which would normalize the economy. But that's not what they're going to do. They're going to expand it. They're going to expand it, and then there's going to be this huge spiral of inflation that takes place, and the actual prices of things are going to go up rather than 6 or 8% a year is what they're doing now. They're going to go up 60 and 100 and 600% and 6,000% a year, and there's going to be chaos. And nobody, I know many Sidhas who are kind of naive, and they think that the Social Security is going to keep going because some Democratic politician said so. Democrat politician, one guy said that. It's crazy, because you got to have people working and making money to pay for the Social Security, and the ratio of recipients to payers in is going up. So, and then there's Medicaid, that's huge, all this wasted and violent money in foreign countries, this terrible, evil behavior of the country, of the empire, the American empire. So we're in bad shape. We're in bad shape karmically, and we're in bad shape in terms of the karma of inflation. And we're gonna pay for it, So instead of doing what you did with Maharshi in the 1998 and not coming to program, I mean, like I say, you don't want to do what's a strain. But what kind of a strain is it going to be when there's riots in the streets in every city in the country because people can't eat, Or let's say you live in the country, you live in a country home somewhere and you feel you're safe, Well, maybe it's okay too, Maybe you got enough food and stuff stocked up. But why do you want to live in a world like that? Is it really, so the question is it your dharma to be in the dome or not? I mean, would it have been your Dharma in 1998 to come back to the dome instead of allowing 9/11 to happen, you know, or in earlier times to prevent Clinton from bombing Serbia, you know, like he did. So it's not a pretty picture we're looking at here, and there's no way in hell we're not going to have a collapse just because we think, well, Nepal has earthquakes. We don't have earthquakes, and if we do, we don't have 4,000 dead, not kind of stuff, because we have more, because we're a big, smart country and all that stuff. We're not a smart country. We're a stupid country, you know. And we're in big trouble unless something changes. And so, uh, you know, it's a wonderful existence here, and I apologize if your experience here wasn't good. But, and you know, you have to do what you have to do, but it's going to be bad. It's going to be bad if the Siddhas don't come here. And these national yogis are helping a little bit. I'm sure they're helping a lot, but it sure would help if we had a foundation of 2,000, 2,500 Siddhas here. All right.